Those that don't know, I'm Jeff Borkart. I'm the Infrastructure and Planning Chair for the Builders Association. I used to be the Assistant Director for the American Planning Association, which is where I met this lovely guy here. We decided that a lot of the planning and infrastructure components of the Builders Association and the American Planning Association align. So between Fred and I, we've planned a series of different workshops over the next 6 to 7 months. And this is the first of them. So thank you all for being here. Those that are on the Zoom, thank you for being here. And I just wanted to say, let's get Infrastructure and Planning Committee back going again. I know it's been a few years since it's been a little dormant during the COVID years. And so I think this is one of the first big workshops as we get this committee back up and running. If anybody, I'll leave some cards up here. If anybody has any other infrastructure and planning workshop ideas, concerns that you've heard within the community that you want us to take on, feel free to reach out to me. Once again, Jeff Borkart, and I'll turn it over to Fred now. Thanks, Fred.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jeff. I'll spend a second or two getting my mic reconnected here. So sorry to the folks on Zoom who have to listen to the rough link. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Fred Steinmann. I'm the director of the University Center for Economic Development at the College of Business at the University of Nevada. Also currently serve as the Northern Section Director of the American Planning Association Nevada Chapter. And it is a pleasure on behalf of both the chapter and the Center for Economic Development to have you here, those on Zoom, and of course, those of you that brave the roads and the drive over today. Thank you very much. In ways of just some little housekeeping for those of you that are here in person, and we'll get the sign-in information via the Zoom meeting. But there's a sign-in sheet coming around. As Jeff mentioned, this is really kind of the kickoff of a series of individual workshops and educational sessions that the Northern Section, the chapter, the Center for Economic Development, Builders Association, and other groups have put together for the coming months, really focus on addressing issues of growth and how we can manage and mitigate those pressures of growth. Specifically here in Northern Nevada, but certainly the things that we'll be talking about between now and July, where we hope to kind of wrap up this series, can be applied across the entire state. Before I kind of get started in the presentation, again, a huge shout out and thank you to Jeff and the folks at the Builders Association in Northern Nevada for helping sponsor this. Support it. Those of you that brave the roads are enjoying lunch. Thanks to the generosity of the Builders Association. Look forward to continuing this partnership moving forward. In kind of a general sense, to begin kind of this ongoing multi-monthly discussion over the next 4 or so months, certainly here in Northern Nevada, but across the state of Nevada, one of the real pressures are cities, counties, regional organizations, private sector folks are facing is really these pressures of growth and what that means in terms of the capacity of communities, in terms of public infrastructure to continue to support that growth, but also the need to continue to develop critical services, both from the public sector perspective, police, fire, EMS, public parks, recreational facilities, general administrative staff, business license departments, but also the continued development of housing, a variety of types, owner-occupied, renter-occupied, multi-unit, single-family residential, detached, additional healthcare, both expanded basic and more advanced, both physical and mental health care services, improved education services and child care services, again, really to kind of support and integrate the population growth that we continue to experience. In my work as director of the Center for Economic Development, I have the pleasure of working with every city, every county, and each of the 8 regional economic development authorities throughout the state. And one of the major problems or challenges that we are having across the state in terms of economic development is workforce, especially in our rural non-metro communities where the average unemployment rate is less than 3%. Certainly here in Northern Nevada, Washoe County, Carson City, and kind of the northwestern corner of the state, our unemployment rate rebounded very, very quickly after the COVID pandemic. Now our region is facing an unemployment rate of less than 5%, and the unemployment rate in Clark County continues to come down off its historical COVID highs. Obviously, given the continued aging of the population in the state, we are not producing enough, internal workforce just through normal population growth. So that means if you need additional workers, you have to import that workforce from other parts of the country and other places wherever on the map. But without additional housing, without additional healthcare, childcare, educational services, and the infrastructure to support that, it's really difficult, right, to be able to recruit and retain that valuable workforce. Of course, on the flip side, cities, county governments in particular have really kind of struggled going back all the way to the Great Recession when it comes to financing infrastructure and critical public services that are necessary to support that population growth and subsequently that workforce development growth as well. Most of you are probably familiar with the insanity of Nevada's fiscal system. It's a fiscal system that was designed in the late 1800s and really hasn't changed much. Cities and counties are predominantly dependent upon property tax and sales tax. Sales tax is very much susceptible to the whims of larger macroeconomic conditions. And the way we assess property and tax it in Nevada pretty much guarantees that 1 year after the next, any given parcel will, pay less in property tax year over year due to natural depreciation, especially on the improvements of property. And of course, we divorce the assessment of property from market values, which is kind of insane and crazy if you think about it, because it's usually when market values are going up and there's increased economic activity and increased population growth where the demand for services starts to increase. Yet a fundamental source of revenue for local governments throughout the state on the property tax side of the equation is almost a declining asset moving forward. So at the very same time, local governments are seeing an increase in demand for services and infrastructure, they are probably experiencing, at least on a parcel by parcel basis, a decline in the property tax revenue. That is accelerated as you get into older neighborhoods. And of course, it is the older neighborhoods that are experiencing the demand for, we need to resurface roads, we need to update, modernize sewer, water, power, all the critical infrastructure needed to support those neighborhoods. So this conversation with Jeff and other members of the chapter, various cities, counties, and the regional development authorities that I work for and with through the Center for Economic Development led us to kind of talk about, well, if we can't continue to rely on traditional forms of property tax and sales tax revenue to support the infrastructure and service development that we know we're going to need, what do we do short of completely redesigning Nevada's fiscal system? Unfortunately, there's not a lot of political appetite in Carson City over the last 4 governor administrations and legislative sessions really to do anything. And of course, in a state like Nevada, which is very much a Dillon's Law state, local governments have very little say when it comes to the fiscal side of the house. So we started looking at different tools in the toolbox. The good news is over the last 40 or so years, the legislature has already authorized and enabled local governments throughout the state to use a variety of funding techniques designed to deal with infrastructure questions and public service questions as well. It's almost like 40, 50 or so years ago, they anticipated and knew that local governments were going to be in this position. So this is a presentation on existing special districts and community and economic development funding tools in Nevada that I've given quite a few times, both locally to various cities, counties, regional economic development authorities, and a few times through the chapter. And it's certainly a pleasure to present this to you today. Click on the actual screen. There we go. So the 4 funding tools that exist in the toolbox for local governments that are probably the most popular. Yes.
I'm so sorry.
Can we get a copy of this presentation?
Just make sure you sign in on that sign-in sheet, and I'll make sure that everyone gets a copy of the slides. And of course, I'll capture that information from the Zoom meeting as well. So the four kind of most common financing tools that are used currently by local governments throughout the state. Special assessment districts is outlined in Nevada Revised Statute 271. Kind of the emerging up and coming dark horse, which is kind of getting increased attention moving forward, or tax increment areas, as outlined in NRS 278C. And then the two that have kind of fallen out of favor. These were the most popular kind of up to the late 1990s, early 2000s, are redevelopment agencies as outlined in NRS 279. And kind of the one that is really dying on the vine is general improvement districts, as outlined in NRS 318. And as we kind of go through each of these four ones today, I'll kind of give you an idea as to why SADs and the dark horse TIAs are becoming increasingly more in favor by local municipalities and counties throughout the state, and why redevelopment agencies and general improvement districts have kind of fallen out of favor. It's really a combination of larger macroeconomic conditions, as well as kind of the restrictions on how redevelopment and general improvement districts can be utilized. But again, the one that has really kind of emerged as the most popular tool used by various cities, counties, and even private developers to finance a variety of infrastructure, public service, and even private construction efforts are the special assessment districts as outlined in 271. I will, of course, preface everything I'll say from this point on is not an attorney. So at a certain point, if you are going to think about pursuing these tools in the toolbox, you probably want to sit down with private legal counsel. And if you work for a city or a county or a public agency, you want to have a conversation with your city attorney or your district attorney or other legal counsel. So not legal advice. I look at this through the lens of the economic developer, right? You know, looking at the barriers to economic development projects and going, well, how do we overcome that? Well, there are some tools in the toolbox. And as I kind of alluded to, 271 again has become, you know, one of the most popular tools, primarily because it's super, super flexible in terms of what you can use a special assessment district or SAD to finance. As well as how it operates in terms of the underlying revenue sources that support the establishment and financing of the special assessment district moving forward. Typically, and again, not legal counsel, so confer with counsel if you move forward on this stuff. But the establishment process of the special assessment district is actually pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot of magic, although the actual public process is going to be more complicated because you start going into the realm of politics, which tends to tap the brakes on the administrative and procedural side. But ultimately, it begins with the establishment of a provisional order, where the local government, city council, county commission, the governing body, either by itself or by petition of property owners or property owner within a proposed potential SAP is going to essentially instruct the city county engineer or designate, to essentially start the process of studying the overall feasibility of establishing the special assessment. The next step is to move forward with the development, establishment, and completion of comprehensive fiscal and economic impact study. Again, you're just trying to do the math and determining what your costs are going to be in terms of what you're going to use SAD funds for, and then determine what the feasibility is in terms of that revenue source being substantial over a defined period of time to finance all the things that you're going to do with the special assessment district itself. Once that fiscal and economic impact study is completed, and if the results are positive in the study, indicating that, yep, this is feasible, at least on paper, then you move into the public hearing process, where essentially the local government, the governing body, the city council, county commission will then establish the SAD and the special assessment district by ordinance. And then
No, I can't. I'm one of the same.
action. Just as a quick
Okay.
FYI for those of you on Zoom, if you could mute your microphone during the meeting, we'll come back at the end of it and do Q&A after the formal presentation. And then again, like I said, you just go into the process of implementation. Let's talk a little bit. Oh, can you click on the slides again? So I can move off of it. In terms of post-process and how this works, the Special Assessment District, the SAD under 271, is not a tax, it's an assessment. It may quack, like a tax, it may walk like a tax, it may look like a tax, but the legislature was very clear, and NRS 271 is very, very clear. This is not a tax, so you are exempt from having to deal with the established state constitutionally implemented property tax cap. What this is the eventual SAD creating an additional assessment on property within the defined special assessment district. What's critical to kind of understand, and one of the benefits of the SAD as opposed to a redevelopment district or a general improvement district, which relies on actual ad valorem property tax revenue, is that the assessment will not necessarily fluctuate from one year to the next, given what is going on with property values. So in the normal world of ad valorem property tax, we take a piece of land, a parcel, we apply a property tax rate relative to the assessed value, and that gives you the amount of money coming from that particular parcel. In the case of the Special Assessment District, you're essentially leveling a flat fee on each individual parcel within the Special Assessment District, saying that this particular parcel piece of land within the established Special Assessment District will pay $250 in this assessment period to finance all the things that we want to finance. And because it is that flat assessment, it really creates stability and predictability from one year to the next on the amount of revenue that can be generated from the Special Assessment District. And that's different and unique from all the other tools in the toolbox, even with the tax increment areas that depend upon tax increment financing. This is not that, right? This is separate of the way in which we normally, tax via the ad valorem property tax system, individual parcels within the district or within that SAD. So again, as I kind of indicated, it may kind of look, quack, and walk like an ad valorem property tax, but it's not. And because of that, there's actually been a few cases in Nevada, most famously the Fremont Street experience, that has used 271 to essentially level assessments on non-property based revenue streams. So the Fremont Street experience as a 271 SAD is actually an additional assessment on taxable retail sales that are generated within that particular SAD. That's kind of become a moot issue. 2 sessions ago of the legislature, I believe, we finally got as close as we've ever been to the true business improvement district approach. We're still not there. We're one of the few states in the United States that do not have a true business improvement district authorizing statute, which I find odd and bizarre in a state like Nevada. But 271 is an approach in that particular regard. It is important to keep in mind that even though the SAD can be created by petition, individual property owners or an individual property owner within a defined geographic area to establish the SAD, ultimate authority for the SAD's existence still lies within the control of the authorizing local government, the city council or the county commission. So they brought it into the world and they can effectively take it out of the world as well. Again, the SAD itself is technically administered and managed by the local government that authorizes it in the first place, although there's probably about 40 or so SADs, 271 SADs operating throughout the state that are actually managed and administered by private entities. In some cases, they are homeowner associations, HOAs, that just delegated by the authorizing local government to do the year-to-year, day-to-day administrative side. But ultimately, again, primary responsibility of administration of the district remains in the hands of the local government that created it. Again, as I kind of mentioned, we're starting to see some experimentation and utilization of some of the subcategories of 271. One of them is the Commercial Area Revitalization Project area, the CAVP. That is the type of SAD that the Fremont Street Experience in Las Vegas was established under. And there's 2 jurisdictions right now that are in the process of establishing a fire protection district under 271 that was added to the 271 statutes, I believe, 2 legislative sessions ago. And again, you have this wide variety, right? Going from a essential business improvement district in 271 in downtown Las Vegas to fire protection districts, also under 271 that are being created. And again, I think that really speaks to the power and the authority and the flexibility that SADs are inherently known for in terms of how you can utilize funds generated from the SAD itself. These are just kind of a list of some of the many, many different uses or eligible projects that can be utilized and funded via a 271 SAD. And you can see it's a fairly lengthy list as we kind of move through this. One thing that makes an SAD particularly flexible, especially relative to the general improvement districts under NRS Chapter 318, is that the 271 SADs don't have to be by statute single purpose districts. So you can actually utilize the SAD to do all of this to a certain degree. You don't have to layer one SAD over another. Although some jurisdictions have started to do that, really just in terms of, bookkeeping efficiency, if you will. But ultimately, SADs, by definition, are really multi-purpose financing tools, including kind of hard, physical, tangible assets, like various infrastructure, like curbs and gutters, storm sewer projects, or a combination of this stuff. Or moving into more of the service provision side, financing and funding, police officers and firefighters, parks and recs, individuals. So again, this is kind of the real power of SADs, is that you can start kind of combining these individual elements as well. SADs have also been utilized in kind of existing built areas. I make that point primarily because in the last decade or so, 271 SADs have really been popular and common in kind of greenfield new development areas, and are really kind of suited to, master plan communities, where you have at the very beginning of the process one property owner, one parcel. And once you establish the SAD over that one parcel in that one particular area, you can utilize the SAD again to finance cost of construction of all the infrastructure and maybe even some amenities and some public services moving forward. And as you are, subdividing individual pieces of land and selling them off, or leasing them out, however you've structured kind of that process of the build out, you simply just inform the new property owners coming in, FYI, there's an additional assessment every month or every year or every quarter, however you decide to structure it, to finance maintenance and long-term sustainability of all of the elements needed to actually create the master plan community or master development. But again, in some cases, the Fremont Street Experience is a good one, an existing built environment where there's already construction that has occurred and growth and development, overlapping an SAD on that area and saying, well, we're going to use the SAD to do acquisition, we're going to assemble property, we're going to demolish property, we're going to support new construction, and then even potentially utilize the funds from the SAD as leverage with other funds moving forward. And in the case of the downtown Reno Redevelopment District, there used to be 2 separate special assessment districts under NRS 271, a police SAD and maintenance SAD, before it was kind of reorganized and combined into the new pseudo business improvement district. Those SADs were essentially utilized as leveraging funds with various federal grant sources, match required in order to fund positions and to do actual construction and improvements within existing built environment. And then kind of in the economic development world, we're starting to see SADs used to support a variety of new business creation, attraction, and existing business retention and expansion efforts. One thing, again, that makes SADs very powerful is that even though you'll do assessments month to month, quarter by quarter, year by year, again, it's really up to you to determine how you're going to establish and set up that assessment process. You can bond against those funds. And most importantly, because the SAD is kind of this middle ground between the public sector and the private sector, you can utilize and begin to access, lower cost municipal debt rates, which can, in an environment like today, where commercial lending rates are on the increase, not the decrease, or at least they're staying relatively high, for private developers to be able to access municipal debt rates, which by definition tend to be significantly lower than kind of open market commercial lending rates. It's a really innovative way and creative way to really reduce overall project costs moving forward. And of course, being able to bond against, say, 10, 15, 20, 30 years of anticipated revenue from the SAD, you can create a fairly significant fund up front at the beginning of the project's creation and construction to pay upfront costs for, again, infrastructure and public services, amenities, whatever it is that the SAD is going to eventually pay for. So again, that's a major advantage of and utilization of this particular tool. And because you are focusing the assessment in a defined geographic area, those property owners and individuals within the SAD are the ones that bear the cost because they get the benefit, right, of proximity to those assets that are funded through the SAD. And in addition to that, again, you could always use SAD funds on an ongoing basis to essentially, pay for maintenance and salaries, and again, all the things necessary to kind of support those things that you're going to utilize the SAD for. Before I move into tax increment areas, one thing I also want to really note about special assessment districts, again, in terms of its flexibility and its freedom, is you don't necessarily have to choose between whether or not bonding, revenues up front or, expending those funds as you're collecting them. How you create and establish the SAD in the first place is critical because it'll enable you to kind of make those choices moving forward. It's also important to keep in mind when it comes to special assessment districts in 271 is they work exactly opposite of how public finance and budgeting works in every other situation. Traditionally and in a normal sense, the way public budgeting works, like many household budgets, is you start at the beginning of a budget year with an idea of how much money you have to spend, right? And then from that pot of money, that you have to spend quarterly, annually, whatever, you start making hard decisions on how you're going to spend those funds, right? Well, this year we only have so many dollars, so road maintenance is going to have to wait because I need to hire 3 new Parks and Recs people. These are the hard choices made in public finance. SADs don't operate that way. In the world of SADs, you start with costs and say, my total anticipated costs to finance debt, to pay maintenance, to pay salaries, whatever I'm doing with the SAD, I estimate that cost up front. And then from that estimated cost over, say, an annual period, you then essentially divide that cost by properties or payees within the SAD, and everybody pays their share of that estimated total cost, which again is kind of challenging for most individuals to get, because it's completely contrary and opposite in the way public finance typically works. In the worlds of SAD, you start with an estimation of costs, and then you construct an assessment that will generate the revenue necessary to cover those costs. And you can actually get fairly creative on how you create and construct that assessment. If you had, say, 100 property owners within a defined NRS 271 SAD, and you're using the SAD to finance the construction of a road, you could, and this has been done in several SADs throughout the state, say those property owners that are closest to that road, or say closest to that rec center or that park, will pay more in the SAD than those farther away. And again, the argument is, well, those closest to the asset are the ones that benefit more. So they should pay more in order to support the SAD moving forward. Again, that is not a tax, right? That is not how the leveling of tax rates work on individual properties. In this case, you can get actually fairly creative in how you structure the assessment moving forward. Again, with the asterisks, you want to talk to legal counsel and make sure that you're not necessarily running afoul some of the limitations in 271. But that's how 271 districts typically operate. Again, think about them as working in reverse of how the typical public finance system tends to operate. NRS 278C is the next one that I'm actually going to spend a significant amount of time on. I'm not actually going to spend too much time on redevelopment agencies in 278 or 279, sorry, and general improvement districts under 318, primarily because they're well-established tools. Everyone kind of gets how they work. And they have really kind of fallen out of favor over the last 10, 15, 20 years. But as I mentioned, SADs, the 271 districts have really grown in favor. When I put this presentation together a couple months ago, when I did this presentation just for the chapter, there were, I think, about 88 active 271 SADs in the state. I think that number is now up to 91 with a couple new SADs that have been established. And a lot of jurisdictions are moving forward.
I'm sorry, what was the number again?
Again, last time I actually looked, it was 88 active 271 SADs. I think that number is up to 90, 91. But it's been a moment since I've actually checked. And unfortunately, there's no central repository in the Department of Taxation to go to. This is not a tax, right? No one's necessarily keeping tabs, as opposed to 278C and then redevelopment agencies and GIUs.
I got a lot of questions, but I'll wait.
Oh, sure, sounds good. So let's talk about 278C. So this is the dark horse. This is my, sitting, up in the rafters looking at the game, prognostication on what the future world might look like. And unfortunately, there aren't many active 278C tax areas out there. The only one that really exists is the one that the City of Henderson created jointly with Nevada State College, and Nevada State College's new campus. If you have the opportunity to go check out Nevada State College in Henderson, their new campus, please do, because it really is amazing. They have utilized 278C, really not a single dollar from the legislature to build that campus and all the individual buildings. They have used the incremental property tax revenue that is being generated from this 278C tax increment area, and new housing, commercial development, and some industrial development around the campus to finance construction of Nevada State College. And why, not every NC institution is utilizing this tool is beyond me. And even though 278C was initially created to benefit Nevada State College and individual NC campuses, talking with a few attorneys and a few folks I know at the Attorney General's office at the state, there's really no necessary limitation that it has to be directly tied to an NC campus. So I think as individuals kind of start to catch on to what the City of Henderson kind of cued into in terms of a powerful financing tool to do a variety of stuff, I mentioned 278C is probably going to start becoming more popular moving forward. too far there. The establishment process of the 278C tax increment area, or TIA, like a redevelopment district, a general improvement district, is a little more involved than the special assessment districts. And that's primarily because the tax increment area, like redevelopment and general improvement districts, well, like redevelopment, kind of like GIDs, begins to reallocate ad valorem property tax revenue. So this is the time now where we're actually getting into the world of ad valorem property taxes. But I mean, to a certain degree, it kind of follows the same process, right? You know, either by petition of the local government or by direct effort of the local city council or county commission, you start the process, right, of studying the overall economic and financial and fiscal feasibility of establishing one of these districts. You do have to develop a preliminary plan and a preliminary estimate of the overall undertaking. You know, how much money are you going to need over the course of the TIA's existence? And, you know, what are the viability of the revenue sources that are going to back those costs? And in this case, it's going to be a reallocation of existing property taxes that are generated from the eventual tax increment area. You do have to establish and create a statement for the proposed TIA that'll include a list of the finalized amount of the assessed valuation of taxable property in the TIA, existing property, and then anticipated property that will be developed and will grow over time as the TIA exists. And then finally, a statement, fairly elaborate statement, and development of the statement of the estimated amount of potential tax proceeds that are going to be collected through the reallocation of existing ad valorem property tax revenues generated from that established district. It is really, really important to keep in mind that TIAs, like redevelopment districts, are not a new tax. There is zero authority in the statute for 278C and 279 redevelopment districts that would enable anybody anywhere to levy an actual ad valorem property tax. General improvement districts 318, yes, you are creating a new ad valorem property tax in that case. But for 278C and 278, you are simply rearranging the allocation of the existing effective ad valorem property tax rate. So, you know, if you're a property owner, when you get your property tax bill, you'll see that there are multiple jurisdictions that get a chunk, right, of the total property tax revenue generated from individual properties. You own a piece of property in Reno, some of that goes to the City of Reno, some of that goes to the Washoe County School District, some of that goes to the government of Washoe County, some of that goes, you know, to the state of Nevada, and then there may be other taxing entities that are entitled to a portion of that property tax revenue. In the tax increment area, we're essentially saying, well, if I was the City of Reno and established that TIA, some of that money that would go to the county, the school district, the state, and other taxing entities, depending upon how it's structured, won't go to them anymore moving forward. It will go to the City of Reno for the specific and explicit purpose of reinvestment back into the established tax increment area. So you just can't create a TIA, grab a bunch of incremental property tax revenue and spend it wherever you want. It has to be spent back in the tax increment area for the benefit of the tax increment area moving forward. In the case of Henderson's TIA with Nevada State College, the primary benefit was build a brand new campus in Nevada State College in Henderson. So new property that was developed, and as property values increased as a result of the campus and new property tax revenues were generated, property tax revenues that would have gone to the county, other taxing jurisdictions within the valley and the state, that goes to the City of Henderson for reinvestment back into that tax increment area. Brand new campus, 20,000 anticipated students moving forward. You're going to need more roads to deal with traffic. You're going to need additional infrastructure. And you may need other things to support the development of that particular campus and the surrounding area as well. Then again, you kind of get into the nitty-gritty weeds of the administrative machine of establishing the 278C tax increment area. The resolution that ultimately has to be adopted by a city council or county commission. You identify what the express purpose is going to be for all proceeds generated from the TIA itself, whether or not that's going to be used to securitize debt, or if it's going to be spent kind of on an ongoing quarter by quarter, month to month, year to year basis, and what that's going to be for. And then again, just whatever bond council wants you to incorporate within that resolution to satisfy them moving forward. Again, you also, like an SAD or a redevelopment district or a GID, you have to designate the location of the actual tax increment area. What are the boundaries of the district itself? And then again, going into the process of getting the city, county engineer or the designates to file with the clerk all preliminary plans, estimated costs, estimated revenues moving forward. And then upon reviewing all of this, making the appropriate findings moving forward, then you can essentially, as the local governing body, city council, county commission, go through the process of creating the TIA through the provisional order. 278C is kind of divided into what's permitted for counties, what's permitted for cities. And again, the definitions for what's permitted for counties in terms of utilization of TIA funds for, counties outlined in NRS 244A 27 through 56. Again, I won't bother bore you with defining that. You can look at the definitions yourself. But typically, this is what you can use tax increment areas for: flood control projects, overpass, sewage, street, underpass, or water projects. Again, as defined within the NRS itself. And again, these types of projects are probably the big ticket upfront infrastructure costs to support new development moving forward. Cities, again, it's almost a mirrored copy and paste definition of flood control, overpass, sewage, street, underpass, and water projects, just a different chapter within the NRS. You can look at those definitions at your own time, work with council to do it. But these are the permitted uses, right? City governments, county governments can utilize tax increment areas to really finance and fund these specific types of infrastructure projects. Again, nowhere's near as flexible, right, and diverse in terms of what you can utilize these funds for, as we see in 271 SAD districts. But because it is the ability to kind of reallocate existing property tax revenues, it's growing in interest, especially by county governments and city governments that want to ensure that locally generated property tax dollars are invested back into the communities that generate them. Politically, like redevelopment districts, this becomes a little challenging for local governments because, as someone who used to work for a redevelopment agency, both here in Nevada and in California, before redevelopment went the way of the dodo in California, I can tell you that other taxing jurisdictions are probably not going to just sit idly by and be cool with this, right? You're going to hear from the school district, you're going to hear from other taxing entities. State probably doesn't care one way or another as long as you're not creating a tax increment area over the Las Vegas Strip. But for the most part, there are going to be political consequences and conversations that local jurisdictions are going to have moving forward. As I did kind of allude to, the tax increment area utilizes tax increment financing, like redevelopment districts, as its primary source of funding. You can add some things to it, but you can't create a new tax. And at the end of the day, what we do in this particular case is beginning in kind of year one, year zero, the farthest to the far on the left side of this figure is we essentially establish what is called a base assessment of property tax revenues from this new tax increment area. What's important to keep in mind is that property tax revenue generated from all property within the new tax increment area in area 2 of this graph are allocated as though a TIA did not exist, right? So school district, county, other cities, the state, other taxing entities, they get what they are entitled to via their effective property tax rates over the entire term of the tax increment area moving forward. It is only the revenue in area 1 of this chart, the incremental property tax revenues that are generated as a result of new growth, that go to finance the tax increment area moving forward. And of course, the argument is, if not for the tax increment area, and the ability to bond and capture future anticipated revenues and invest it back into this geographic TIA area, that increment not exist, right? I mean, that's the whole rationale of establishing TIA and being able to capture those future revenues, because you're saying, well, the reinvestment of those future revenues that we're going to capture via a bond, right, get it all up front, is what's going to support and spur the growth in the tax increment area. So if you're a taxing entity that's going to be impacted, that's the pushback argument, and say, you're not losing anything that you wouldn't normally get, because you're still getting in the area 2 box from the base, but it is only that incremental stuff that you're going to essentially not be getting. And of course, you can also make the argument that at the end of the TIA's existence, that taxing entity, the city or the county that created the tax increment area in the first place, is returning back to everybody property that is more valuable than when we started the TIA in the first place, because the TIA was able to support all the growth, the development, and the infrastructure that expanded and grew property values moving forward. Again, that's easy to say coming from the once upon a time ago redevelopment and economic development guy. There are arguments on the other side. School districts will say, especially in the case of Henderson, where there's a lot of new residential development, single family residential development that is supporting that tax increment area. Well, the people moving into those homes are families with school age kids, K through 12, that we're having to educate. And we're not getting any of that incremental property tax revenue at this point. So there is a cost incurred, and it's a legitimate position. And that's why in the case of Henderson's TIA, and this has been kind of ongoing negotiations in other jurisdictions that are considering utilizing the TIA, they've looked at ways of not necessarily capturing 100% of future incremental property tax revenues from the TIA, but saying, okay, you'll get a portion of that as the school district or the state or whoever. That way you can pay your costs, but we're going to capture some because we have some pretty significant upfront costs: infrastructure, roads, sewer, flood control, again, all the things that are listed as appropriate infrastructure projects using this particular financing tool. But it's tax increment financing 101, essentially. Just kind of, to a certain degree, I hate to say it, almost kind of the poor man's redevelopment district. Redevelopment agencies, you know, as we'll talk about in a second, are really kind of the great granddaddy of all these tools in terms of power, strength, and flexibility. But again, for a variety of reasons, the 279 redevelopment agency approach and subsequently the GIB 318 approach have just fallen out of favor for a variety of conditions that we'll talk about. Like the SADs and everything else, again, you can bond against this stuff, which is great because you can anticipate future growth and future incremental property tax revenues. And again, from the private development side, you can again begin to access, you know, cheaper, less expensive municipal debt rate for funding, as opposed to dealing with relatively high interest rates right now to finance all the things that you might want to finance in a large, you know, master plan community and development. And again, you know, critical to work with the city or county engineer or the designate to identify what can be funded via the TIA and what can't be. And this is probably what has limited the spread of tax increment areas up to this point, because that is not necessarily a concern in the SAD 271 world, where there's just a much wider variety of potential uses for the 271 SADs than 278C or any of the other tools within the toolbox. Again, TIAs are kind of my dark horse candidate for the next big thing. We'll continue to look at the city of Henderson and see how that goes, but they've been doing it for over a decade now and they've had pretty good success, so we'll see where that goes. The next two I want to talk about quickly, and again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. You know, want to make sure that we have time for Q&A amongst those of us here in the room and those on Zoom as well. I want to talk quickly about 279 redevelopment districts and 318 general improvement districts. And the reason I include them is they're still being used. I mean, they're not, you know, being completely swept under the rug, but there are just a variety of now legislative constraints, general macroeconomic issues that have made 279 and 318 kind of less popular. But there's still tools in the toolbox. And if you're doing your due diligence on new projects, and you're trying to deal with rising construction costs and costs of building infrastructure and providing various services, it's probably worthwhile to at least kick the tires on this stuff to see if it's appropriate and applicable for you. Again, all of this for 279 is outlined within the statute of what you can and cannot do. Typically, however, as opposed to SADs, general improvement districts, and tax increment areas, the idea behind redevelopment is that you're taking an established built area, typically downtowns that are showing their age, right? You know, there's high degree of what the statute defines as blight, both physical and economic, right? Abandoned buildings, you know, crumbling infrastructure, you know, various, you know, low-paying jobs, just general stagnation in economic activity. And we need to inject some steroids in it and get that area going again. Primarily because where redevelopment districts currently exist in Nevada are traditional downtown urban cores. They are, you know, the living heart, if you will, of a city. You know, downtowns have always been viewed that way. And if your downtown core is suffering, chances are that's not doing much for larger community-wide or even region-wide growth and development as well. So the general idea is over a defined period of time, you're going to inject and focus a ton of financial resources. Again, like tax increment areas, it utilizes property tax increment financing into a defined geographic area. You're going to try to mitigate and eliminate physical and economic blighting conditions as defined in 279. And at the end of a, say, 50-year redevelopment period, you have returned a healthy, growing, robust, vibrant urban core back to the community in the regional landscape. Again, you can kind of look at all of the statute yourself. One important thing to kind of keep in mind is the discussion in 279 regarding duration of existence of the redevelopment district, as well as areas that are eligible for inclusion. Unlike 271 SADs and unlike 318 tax increment areas, and unlike 318 general improvement districts, not everywhere is going to be a redevelopment district. You do have to meet eligible criteria under the definitions of physical and economic blight. And they are very, very specific. I mean, we all kind of have an idea of what blight means in our mind. The legislature had a different idea, and they put in very, very specific definitions to blight within NRS 279. And you do have to make the appropriate findings that enough blight exists in order for that district to be created. Redevelopment districts can also not be used in essentially virgin vacant parcels, greenfield areas. I believe the statute is 75% of all land within a proposed redevelopment district must be developed and improved. They don't tell us what improved is, but you have to make that finding. And I've seen, you know, improved be, well, here's a 500-acre piece of land. It's a single parcel and there's a road going through it, right? A dirt road. It's been improved. There you go. That qualifies. I'm not sure that would stand a legal challenge, but again, the statute's kind of vague in that regard. But 75% of the district has to be improved. Again, that standard does not exist in 271, 278C, or 318 in the other financing tools, but it does exist here. And redevelopment districts, unlike everything else, have to expire at an end of a defined period of time from its creation. Typically, when you first establish a redevelopment district, you get an initial 30 years. And at the end of 30 years, the local government that created it has to make a determination whether or not you're going to extend for another 10 years out to 40 years. And then at the end of 40 years, again, you reassess and go, do we go another 10 years to the 50-year mark? If you get to 50 years, you must terminate and sunset on that date. With exceptions for, you know, being able to collect revenue sufficient to retire debt. But redevelopment districts really cannot exist more than 50 years. That doesn't exist for the other stuff. The other stuff is essentially going to last for as long as you need it to exist. Redevelopment districts are unique in this particular case. And once the RDA expires, the redevelopment district, you cannot overlay a new redevelopment district over that area for a minimum of 100 years. And that's primarily because redevelopment, as opposed to TIAs, can gobble up significantly more incremental property tax revenue that goes to all various taxing jurisdictions. So at a certain point, the legislature said, listen, don't be so greedy, right? You've got to gobble up 100% of incremental property tax revenues over a 250-year mark. At a certain point, you've got to give that boost up and say enough, right? The other jurisdictions have to get back into the taxing game. General process, again, you can kind of look at it. This is where you get legal counsel kind of involved. Once the redevelopment district is established, like everything else, you go through the process of implementation. What is different, again, from 271, 278C, and 318 is that you are actually creating a brand new semi-public entity called a redevelopment agency. Legally, it exists independent of the city or the county that establishes it. And that's primarily because the redevelopment agency is going to engage in highly risky real estate projects and investments. And we know, some of this can work, some of it can't. And cities and counties want to insulate themselves from the potential of failure in competitive real estate markets. So that's why they create these kind of semi-autonomous entities as a firewall between volatility in real estate markets and the impact of the credit rating of the jurisdiction. Not to point to any one particular jurisdiction, but there is one in Nevada that took a fairly significant hit between 2008 and 2010 during the financial crisis and real estate crisis, because a judge said, well, you didn't do a very good job buffering and creating a firewall between your redevelopment agency and your city government. So even though the debt was issued by the redevelopment agency, because we can't tell the difference between the redevelopment agency and the city government is now on the hook for the $30+ million of debt that the agency had, all while property values total for that redevelopment district fell by 80% because of the collapse of the real estate market. So the agency obviously didn't have any incremental property tax revenues to pay the debt. They were about ready to just give up the goose and say, oh, well, tough love if you're the investors who bought the debt. But that had to halt because the judge essentially said, you didn't create that firewall very well. So city government, you're on the hook for that debt, even if the redevelopment agency falls and goes away. So this is why it's super important in this particular case to really involve legal counsel to ensure that the agency is created independent to a degree of the local government that creates it. That said, like all these things, local government brought it into the world, it can take it out of the world as well. Ultimate authority rests with the public body that creates it in the first place. Again, what makes redevelopment so powerful is that there are very few limitations and restrictions on how tax increment financing revenue generated and collected by the redevelopment agency can be used within the redevelopment district. It really does represent a significantly long-term financing strategy to support primarily private development, right? I mean, redevelopment has been used to finance private real estate development here in Reno, and Sparks, other communities throughout Nevada, and really throughout the entire United States. Sure, they can do the infrastructure stuff, but redevelopment agencies tend not to do those things because infrastructure by itself doesn't generate incremental property tax revenues. Private development generates incremental property tax revenues. So if you get a developer that comes to town and says, I want to build a 15, 20-story condominium tower in your downtown, but I'm $10 million short of $100 million total project cost, you go to the redevelopment agency and say, hey, can I get $10 million so I can close that gap in the financing of the construction that I want to do? And of course, the redevelopment agency in normal times would be happy to do that because it doesn't really care about the $10 million up front. It cares about the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in new incremental property tax revenue that condominium is going to create, plus all the spin-off development that a new condominium project in a historically blighted downtown core is likely to rejuvenate and increase as well moving forward. So the real focus of redevelopment is to finance new and transformative projects, eliminate, mitigate blight so that you can kind of return to a proactive and positively growing urban core and urban environment that'll generate all types of economic activity. Redevelopment is much more an economic development tool as opposed to SADs, GIDs, and tax increment areas, which are predominantly financing tools. Redevelopment is a much broader economic development tool. Again, like everything else, it would be used for matching funds. It's why redevelopment was initially created both here in Nevada and other parts of the United States in the 1940s and 50s. As the federal government created things like the Federal Housing Administration and other federal grant sources, federal funding sources said, hey, you have to have matching funds, right? We're not just going to write you a blank check. We want to see you commit. So a lot of state legislatures, Nevada being one of them, said, great, we'll use this thing called redevelopment where we can generate and raise a ton of incremental property tax revenue all at once and use that as matching funds in a variety of areas. You can also kind of utilize redevelopment in conjunction with other tools like special assessment districts. Currently in Reno, for example, there is a special assessment district in the Cabela's Verdi area that was used to do some infrastructure improvements, the new highway interchange with I-80. It's also part of a redevelopment district, Reno Redevelopment Project Area number 2. And again, the idea is we want to leverage funds. We want to create the biggest pool of resources up front to spur private development in areas where private development may not occur. And again, it's one of the things that makes redevelopment very powerful. Now, over the last couple of sessions, the legislature didn't like that very much. My love to the folks at the City of Sparks, but the City of Sparks might have gotten a little too aggressive in the utilization of redevelopment with what at the time was called sales tax anticipated revenue bonds or STAR bonds. Where you can get both incremental property tax revenues via redevelopment and incremental sales tax revenue via the STAR bonds or tourism improvement districts. Well, the marina were both of those. And of course, historically, the argument for redevelopment positively was what do cities, counties, and state care about property tax revenue? What they're going to care about is all this new sales tax revenue we're going to be generating through new economic activity. Well, when the City of Sparks overlaid a tourism improvement district and a redevelopment district in the marina, they were essentially getting both pots of money, and that argument disappeared. The legislature didn't like that very much. So moving forward, they said it's either or. You either get a tourism improvement district or a redevelopment district. You can't have both. So there's been some limitations on the flexibility of redevelopment in that particular way. But for at least the time being, you can still overlay redevelopment with GIDs, tax increment areas, and special assessment districts. We'll see if that changes, right? Usually the legislature is reactive and not proactive in those particular cases. Again, relative to everything else, redevelopment being the great granddaddy of this stuff, you can do a ton of stuff with that. You know, everything from traditional acquisition, assembly, demolition of property, down to creating revolving loan funds for new business creation efforts. Very, very flexible tool in that regard. And like tax increment areas, it utilizes tax increment financing, right? Everyone who is entitled to a portion of property tax revenue from a redevelopment district gets that off of the base, which is established in like year 1, year 0 of when the agency is created. It is the stuff above that base, that incremental revenue that goes specifically to the redevelopment agency to fund all the things that it wants to fund. Typically some things to consider, and again, this is more for the attorneys, you know, thinking about how you deal with risk and mitigate risk. Again, what kind of hampered the downtown Reno redevelopment district? It was only about 200 acres and not a lot of diversity in property owners, you know, primarily commercial, not a lot of residential. So at the end of the day, it was particularly exposed to the impacts of the Great Recession and the real estate market collapse. That's why you see redevelopment districts, you know, since the Reno downtown Reno redevelopment district created back in the 1970s being much larger and much more diverse because risk is a real thing that redevelopment agencies are going to have to deal with. And the massive percentage of the total property tax base in the downtown that were dedicated to hotel casinos really acted as an anchor back in 2008 through 2010. They had massive devaluations granted to them by the county assessor, and that essentially dragged down the redevelopment district. And it didn't matter what other things happen in the downtown once you wiped away 80% of essentially the base. That was the end of the redevelopment district moving forward. Just absolutely no way that you can make up 80% of the property tax base moving forward. The last one again is 318 general improvement districts. And again, another tool that's kind of gone out of favor for redevelopment districts. Again, the risk of real estate market activity has been a death nail for them. Plus any jurisdiction and area that kind of qualifies for a redevelopment district is already a redevelopment district. So there's not much flexibility in creating new ones. General improvement districts have kind of fallen out of favor primarily because of how limited they are. They are a new tax. Because they are a new ad valorem property tax, they must fit under the state constitutional property tax cap of $3.64 per $100 of assessed value. And because almost every single county and city in the state is at or near that ad valorem property tax cap already, that there just isn't much flexibility and room to establish new or 318 general improvement districts. So this is why they're just falling out of favor. And in other cases, they've fallen out of favor because typically, and there are some exceptions, but for the most part, general improvement districts must be single purpose districts. You can only do one thing, and it's fairly restricted on what you can do with those funds within the GID, as opposed to SADs, tax increment areas, and even redevelopment districts, where you can use $1 multiple ways. In GIDs, that ain't the case. You essentially have to use that $1 one specific way, and it can never, ever change ever again. In counties like Douglas County, that were kind of the real users of general improvement districts, have actually started to close and sunset existing GIDs or combine them because you just can't really generate enough revenue to do much with a single individual GID. Again, this is kind of, general overview of what you can do with a GID. Ultimately, it's all about public use, promoting health, safety, prosperity, security, general welfare, whatever that means, in terms of how the courts have interpreted that moving forward. The initiation or construction and creation of a GID is very similar to an SAD. Again, it begins either by petition or independent action of a city council or county commission. Go ahead, study the overall feasibility of this, and then ultimately come back to us and tell us, the overall feasibility of how the GID can be used. The difference is within the GID formation, you have to be explicit on how GID funds are going to be used. And moving forward, you cannot deviate unless you go in and completely change the GID moving forward. So you have to commit up front, right? We're going to use this only to pay debt that is going to be issued to build a road from A to B, period, end of story. You cannot be as flexible as you can be with an SAD, even a TIA or a redevelopment district moving forward. And again, that's kind of why this particular tool has just fallen out of favor. Ultimately, there's a process in terms of establishing and identifying the physical boundaries of the GID, notifying property owners, current and future, and then going through the public hearing process like you would on all these individual tools. There are 21 very specific authorized powers and activities that a GID can do. Here's the list. Again, I won't waste your time reading them for you or defining them. They're defined in statutes. But again, you have to pick one at a time. You can overlay multiple GIDs on top of each other. But again, given that most jurisdictions are at or near the ad valorem property tax cap, you're talking about one GID for, say, furnishing facilities for television services with an effective property tax rate of 0.000000002%. You're not generating a ton of revenue off of that. And again, that's why this has kind of fallen out of favor as a financing tool. Again, you are levying a tax. There are, in some cases, the opportunity to do other things like charge tolls. But for some odd reason in Nevada, we just don't like tolls on toll roads. So that hasn't ever been utilized in the state of Nevada moving forward. And in other cases, you can actually charge for services. The Incline Village General Improvement District is an example of one of those that does that. They have a golf course. That's essentially a fee, a charge for service. Plus, they have other fees and charges for services that they offer. But really, the primary revenue source is the ability to levy that tax. But again, SADs, probably the most important and growing tool today. TIAs are kind of your dark horse on what's kind of in the future. Redevelopment districts and general improvement districts kind of going the way of the dodo at this particular point in time. I think we have about 15 or 20 minutes or so. More than happy to take questions. Got one here in the room.
Yeah, thanks, Fred, for your presentation and sharing your expertise. We're Toll Brothers, and we're in the process of pursuing an SAD through the City of Reno. Just got our deposit agreement approved last week with a fair amount of trauma at council. One of the things that came up from one of the members was that, well, these are just the developer handout. That, you know, we're effectively looking at giving the developer for money that will just get put on the backs of the eventual homeowner. How would you help respond to that comment?
You know, for those of us, for those of you online, the general question is, how do you kind of deal with the political question of this just feels like a public handout to private development? My answer is it's not a handout from anybody to anybody. Because again, you're not reallocating tax revenue in any regard, right? Like when we think about, you know, public assistance of private development, you know, say for example, how the Governor's Office of Economic Development uses tax abatements, you know, that is a reallocation of public resources to a private entity. In the case of special assessment districts, 271s in particular, there is no reallocation of anything. This is money that, you know, the city or the county or other public agencies haven't collected and would not collect if not for the establishment of the SAD. And the SAD is nothing more than an assessment levied on existing and future property owners within that SAD to pay for benefits that will specifically benefit those within the SAD moving forward. And historically, the way that's been resolved is the same way that we disclose in subdivisions of master plan communities to new property owners. You're buying into an HOA, right? And FYI, in addition to paying the property tax bill for the city, the county, the school district, the state, and everybody else, there is this additional fee for the, to a degree, privilege of living in this community. And those funds are going to be used to maintain the roads or pay for fire protection services or parks and recs or communal facilities. Again, that is money that is not coming from the public. It is coming from property owners or even business owners within a defined geographic area so that they can get a direct benefit from that additional assessment. So I honestly don't understand what that argument is from various public entities or even, you know, to a degree, the public in general, that this is a public handout. This is money that goes from one private interest, property owners, to another private interest, the developer or the entity that will manage that development moving forward. The involvement of the public sector really is just to tap and utilize the tool that exists within state law, and of course to access the favorable public debt rates, which are significantly cheaper right now than when you get a private market. And then again, the property owner at the end of the day buying into this SAD, this neighborhood, this development, can make the decision for themselves.
Well, that's exactly right, because the comment was, well, will you limit or lessen the sales price of your home because of this assessment versus neighboring properties that don't have it? I mean, it seems like the market will just figure that out.
And that's kind of the approach I take is, you know, the end user, purchaser, or business that moves into that SAD is going to be able to make the decision for themselves. And of course, in some cases, some communities are even thinking about utilizing SADs to do exactly that, lower costs of not all the housing, but some of the housing. Because the developer is going, well, if I'm going to build, say, 200 units, right? Well, maybe I can set aside 10%, right? I'm just picking a number that are going to be essentially reduced in terms of price. But again, I need a way to kind of make that up so the financing on my end works. So again, I can create this SAD over the entire area and say, well, future revenues that we're going to collect are going to allow me to reduce prices on certain units moving forward. But again, that's up to the developer, and the property owners to arrive to that conclusion. I almost hate to say this, but the city or the county that would establish an SAD to a degree, and I know I'm going to catch flack for this, is almost kind of a middleman in terms of establishing the SAD and administering it. You are not taking dollars from a public pot of money and moving them to a private pot of money. You are moving dollars from a private pot of money to another private pot of money. It really is just that financing tool. Can I answer your question?
Thanks. Yeah.
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to say you are an excellent public speaker.
It's just like giving this presentation so many times I press play in the brain. Thank you.
It's the professor.
I have two questions. We understand, I think, that for an SAD, that we cannot finance things such that will be owned by a private company like the energy company. It has to be owned by the city. Is that really the law?
I would say, again, this is asking me legal advice, so I'm very, very cautious. Always talk to counsel on this. I would say from my experience, that's not necessarily true. Although there are SADs and the primary use has been to finance public assets, roads, sewer, fire station, pay for police officer salaries. There are examples out there, and the Fremont Street experience is one of them, of where 271 SADs are used to finance construction of eventually privately owned assets. So in the case of the Fremont Street experience, the downtown Las Vegas area, 271 via the Commercial Area Vitalization Project, sub-district of SADs, was utilized primarily to finance bathroom facilities, privately owned by private property owners, utilized by visitors to the area, but privately owned, not owned by the city of Las Vegas, not owned by Clark County or any public entity. So I would say there are different examples out there of where 271 SADs have been used to finance privately owned assets down the road.
Then my other question, my best questions, why could the city of Henderson not have just passed an ordinance, skipped all the TIA stuff, bonded that revenue stream, and they could have been done a year earlier, probably?
So in that particular regard, if they did that, they would be limited only to property tax revenues that they have direct control over. The tax increment area, like the redevelopment district, allows them to begin to bond over property tax revenues that would go to other public taxing entities. So establishing the TIA in the first place and going through that process enables them to capture a much broader pool of public tax revenues than they could do so on their own.
Then I have a misunderstanding. Can't they pass an ordinance and say it's a fee, not a tax?
No, because, and again, it's a legal question, and the attorney, there might be an attorney that would disagree with me on this, but this is the price of living in what is considered a Dillon's Law state. So in most public administration, public policy worlds, there are two types of states: home rule, where local government does whatever it wants to do with no encumbrance from the state legislature. And then there are Dillon Law states, and we're one of them in Nevada, where local governments can only do, cities and counties, what the legislature enables and authorizes them to do. So the city of Henderson or any public agency might have wanted to do that, but by law, they are not permitted to do that because the legislature hasn't specifically empowered them to do it. What they have empowered Henderson and other jurisdictions to do are things like SADs, general improvement districts, and tax increment areas. And that's just the legal structure of Nevada. You can only do as local governments what the legislature, the supreme law in Nevada, says. That's why our property tax is capped at $3.64 for $100 of AV, even though local governments probably love to raise it beyond that, they can't. The state constitution says that's it. And there are legal consequences for jurisdictions that disobey the legislature. That's the reality. Question online, and then we'll come back.
Yeah, we have Art on Zoom. Go ahead, Art.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred. Very good presentation as always. For those in the audience that may not know, downtown Reno has a business improvement district known as the Downtown Reno Partnership. I believe it was established under a special assessment district. But question for you, Fred, is there some reason, well, let me back up. There's a significant amount of property within the boundaries of that district that are unimproved, that will someday be improved and thereby generate a significant amount of tax increment. Fred, is there some reason that that area can't be redesignated or overlaid with a tax increment area, in your opinion?
Well, so if it's a TIA under 278C, then one doesn't exist currently. In terms of potentially overlapping the 278C in the future on an existing 271 SAD, which in this case is our kind of poor man's business improvement district in Nevada. That's a conversation for another day. And again, this is probably a question for the Attorney General's office. I don't see anything in the statute that would prohibit that or expanding the existing SAD, the 271 Business Improvement District, to include additional lands. Again, this is the horse trading that goes on in City Council between public sector interests and the public sector, private sector. I don't see any legal barrier to doing that. It's probably political preference, not knowing the mind of staff or property owners. But I don't know of anything particularly in the statute that would prohibit that.
But it's not a TIA, it's part of RDA 1, I think.
Right. So our question again was the existing BID, the Downtown Business Improvement District is a 271. Why couldn't you overlay a tax increment area via 278C?
And I don't know about that, but I think there already is some tax increment that would be captured.
Yeah, so there's a redevelopment district under 278C, the downtown RDA District 1. And as you start to get south on that business improvement district, you then get in the world of RDA number 2, the new district that was created back in 2004, 5, something like that. So the legislature has only explicitly said that you can't have RDAs and tourism improvement districts overlap. So I don't know why you couldn't overlap a TIA with an RDA with an SAD, but again, because there's already a tax increment financing district in place in a redevelopment district, there's probably no increment to actually capture. And given the collapse in property values within the existing redevelopment districts going back to the Great Recession, the base is almost non-existent at this point. So the answer to your question is probably more practical and economic. There just isn't enough base property tax revenue and anticipated future growth to support a tax increment area overlay. But you already have one in redevelopment. And that's more
I thought it was questionable whether or not that project area even exists anymore because it lapsed, and then, and that's one thing we haven't looked into. But what's your understanding? Did that, because I thought it was never really legally extended.
Yeah, both redevelopment districts for the City of Reno, RDA 1, RDA 2, do absolutely exist. They're listed in the state red book.
Okay.
Department of Taxation.
Okay.
But they're generating next to nothing.
Well, at this point, but I mean, there's so much vacant land there now that once we get out of this recession, I can see there being quite a bit of new development taking place there, thereby generating the increment we're talking about.
Well, and here's kind of the thing with redevelopment districts, and it's never really been clear by the legislature whether or not increment is collected, in terms of parcel by parcel or for the district as a whole. So if you have large parcels of land like the casinos that have had massive devaluations over the last 2 decades, going back to the Great Recession and even the 9/11 recession we experienced at the turn of the century, that essentially wipes away any incremental growth anywhere else within the district. And amending the district to take out underperforming properties is problematic because there's quite a bit of case law and statute about cherry picking, your districts. You can't just say, well, I only want stars and I want no dogs. If you use these tools, especially redevelopment districts, and to a degree, tax increment areas, you have to take it all. And that's, again, some of the macroeconomic problems we have with redevelopment districts today. But Art, it's an interesting question.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I think it's one that certainly, merits some additional exploration.
I'll ask you quick because I gotta go. So, and if I could follow up with you.
Oh, definitely.
I have my offices in the Innovation Center, so.
Oh,
so
perfect. And my contact information is on the screen, so you get a quick snap.
So, and forgive me because I come at this world a whole different angle. First off, I think it's Napoleonic. I did business in Louisiana and they got their own way, right? And trust me, it's not gonna go away anytime soon. So the reality is this. So it's a risk measure that has a surety aspect. Very interesting. So we got a bonding capacity, right? And I've got to research this. Maybe you have the research. There's always a bonding report somewhere. I mean, the money guys always track success and failure. So in the current environment right now, munis suck. I'm sorry, they do. It was a loss. If anybody has any munis, I'm sorry. Change your portfolio, get a new money manager. And so cities now are really strapped. McKinsey report came out, you know who those guys are. They came out with a report about usage fees, right? And so what I'm hearing here is a user fee model turned on its side. This is crazy.
Yeah, and you're exactly right, because again, one of the underlying reasons why you would pursue any of these funding tools is to take obligation off of the general fund, right? You are trying to localize cost so that you can focus revenues to cover those costs. And again, SADs themselves are really designed to deal with that because you don't start with revenues first, you start with an estimate of costs first, and then you construct an assessment for that one assessment period, a quarter, a month, a year, that will guarantee you the revenue necessary to cover costs. That is absolutely opposite of how everything else is done in the world of public finance, where you start with an estimation of revenues first, and then you pray to God over the course of a fiscal year that you will have enough revenues at the end to cover your expenditures. In SADs 271, you start with expenses first and guarantee yourself via the assessment the revenue that you're going to need to cover those costs moving forward, be it finance of debt or paying for stuff as you go.
So I gotta say this, there's nobody from Florida here, right? I won't offend anybody. Florida's been doing this for years. This whole thing at Disney, if anybody knows the history of that, this is right, and this is a SAD 101.
Sure.
And so I'm gonna leave my cards if anybody wants to shoot me an email. So this is an intriguing thing going on. I don't know who in the room has been outside Nevada, but this is really fascinating. And I really would like to get some case studies on duration, because it all comes down to how long it lasts, right?
And, well, with SADs, the 271 side of things, it's not really clear in the statute if there is any term to how long they can last. They essentially can last for as long as you need them to, and as long as property owners or the payees on the assessment within the SAD are willing to pay for it. And as long as they're still getting benefit, why wouldn't they continue to pay for it?
Unless you make the state angry.
And even then, given the fact there's 90 or so SADs and the jurisdictions seem to be happy with them and the private sector seems to be happy with them, I don't think the legislature, again, I don't want to speak for the legislature in any way, state employee, they sign my paycheck. Like why put the financial responsibilities back on the general funds of cities and counties when you have a funding tool that seems to be working and growing in popularity? So I don't see any desire by the legislature to get into this. In fact, they're even looking at expanding it and creating new housing and transportation districts, which is kind of an expansion of these programs.
So I'd like to